Hey there, hello, and welcome to Lecture 0 in my course, Project Cost Estimation and Risk Analysis. Now, I have two different courses that I'm a course coordinator in. My first course is called Project Management 1, and the second course, it was supposed to be named Project Management 2, but for bureaucratic reasons, administration says that I cannot do that. So instead, the second course has a more content-appropriate name, which is Project Cost Estimation and Risk Analysis. And funny story, it used to be named Cost Estimation and Risk Analysis in projects, but administration said that I'm not allowed to do that either, so I need to put the project from the end of the sentence and put it into the front of the sentence. So nevertheless. My first course is mandatory. All the students in my study program has to do it. You have no choice. There is no free will. But my second course is not mandatory. It's a free elective course, so I feel like I need to promote it a little bit and kind of convince you to take it, or actually I kind of want to do the opposite. I want to convince people to not take the course. So I want to make this lecture 0 here to ensure that students make an informed decision of whether or not they want to enroll in my second course. So throughout this lecture 0, I want to kind of go through the material, kind of give an overview of the content in my second course, and kind of name drop a little bit the different sources of literature that I will be relying on. So let's do that. First of all, what is the relationship between my two courses? The second course is a follow-up course to the first course, obviously, but the first course is a little bit like the 2016 video game No Man's Sky, which was famously described as being wide as an ocean and deep as a puddle. And that is basically how I feel about the Project Management 1 course. We are covering an enormous amount of different topics, so many different things. It's wide as an ocean in terms of its content, but we don't really cover any amount of detail. So detail-wise, it's kind of deep as a puddle. That is kind of the first course. The second course, Project Cost Estimation and Risk Analysis, is basically the exact opposite. We cover a very narrow set of topics, but we go really, really deep. Kind of like the dwarves of Moria in Lord of the Rings. They dug too deeply and they found something they didn't quite like.
The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep.
That is what's going on in this second course. So, what is my second course all about? It is kind of in the name. We are essentially interested in being able to estimate investment costs. And that is of importance because if you are enrolled in my study program, you are probably familiar with the net present value equation, which you have probably been taught in several different courses already. But for the uninitiated, I have two videos which talks a little bit about what net present value is, both in theory and how to implement it. You can look at that if you need. But net present value is kind of one of the basic tools within business economics that we use to determine whether or not we want to undertake a particular investment or a particular project. The equation itself is not really that difficult. It's pretty straightforward, as you can see here on the screen. You just take all the cash flows generated by the project, you discount them by dividing by 1 plus the discount rate to the power of the time period, and you subtract the investment cost, blah, 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 blah. It's not really difficult. The challenge with net present value is actually to figure out the inputs. For the purpose of teaching and for the exams you've probably taken so far, you have probably just been told, well, the cash flows are such and such. The discount rate, maybe you need to calculate that using the weighted average cost of capital equation, and maybe you have to go even further in deeper and use the capital asset pricing model to calculate the cost of equity. But it's pretty straightforward, just given the information. And investment costs usually are resolved. Well, investment cost is 10 millions, for instance. In praxis or in reality, we don't really just get a number out of the either. We need to estimate it ourselves. That is actually often quite more challenging than just using net present value equation in and of itself. So that's where this course comes in. How to figure out what the investment cost is and then use that as an input in the net present value equation. Now that sounds very narrow, but the techniques and methods I'm going to teach in this course can be used to estimate all sorts of things, not just the CAPEX, the capital expenditure. You can also use it to estimate the duration of activities, the duration of projects. You can use it to estimate the cash flows. You can use this to estimate basically any kind of unknown quantity. So, what are the major components of the course? As I said, it's kind of in the name. It's called cost estimation and risk analysis. So basically there are two major branches or topics or categories within my course. First of all, for doing cost estimation in projects, we're interested in two things. First of all, we're interested in coming up with some kind of point estimate. A point estimate is essentially just a number. So a point estimate, when you are estimating the project cost, would be to say that we believe that the project cost is going to be 10 millions or 100 millions or 89 millions, 108 millions, doesn't matter, just one particular number. That is a point estimate. That is ultimately what we are interested in obtaining when you do cost estimation. But for decision-making purposes, it is seldomly sufficient to only know a single number, only knowing the point estimate. We would additionally like to know the inherent uncertainty of that point estimate. Quite often we will be able to say something like, there's a 95% chance that the cost will be within plus or minus 20% of this point estimate. Like something like that is usually what we also want to have access to, information we want to have access to when we are doing decision making. So the second part of the course is about identifying a probability density function, a PDF. PDF, if you don't remember from statistics, that's just if you mention a normal distribution like the bell-shaped curve, that is the PDF, the probability density function. So we want to identify not only a point estimate, but we also want to have the PDF that is associated with that point estimate. Now the point estimate could be the mean or average or expected value of that PDF or the statistical distribution, or it could be the median, or it could be the mode. It's kind of not really a consensus in literature if you should look at the median, mode, or mean. But nevertheless, we want two things. We want point estimate and we want the PDF. So let me talk a little bit about how we get either of these two. When it comes to finding the point estimate, we can look at the project management body of knowledge. So according to the PM book, which is an acronym for Project Management Body of Knowledge, there are 10 different methods for cost estimation. By the way, like the PM book, that is kind of the so-called Bible of project management. It is a collection of best practice, so one of the most well-respected sources of best practice. So this is a good point of departure whenever you want to learn something about project management. So according to the PM book, 10 different methods. And in my course, I want to dedicate a 4-hour lecture to most of these 10 different methods. So what are these methods? They're kind of we can kind of go through them in any kind of order here, but let's start out with what's called expert judgment. Expert judgment is what is that? It is the most commonly used method when it comes to project management, and probably also the least respected, or in a theoretical sense the least respected. Expert judgment works pretty simply by asking yourself, are you an expert? If you want to estimate the cost of a project, you ask yourself, are you an expert on this? If the answer is no, well, then you go and find an expert and ask that person. And then that person will give you an estimate. But if you are the expert, then expert judgment involves either consulting your intuition, your gut feeling, or use your expertise to decide to use one of the other 9 methods. So there's not much really there to be said about expert judgment in that sense. Now the second method here, and again in no particular order, is the so-called bottom-up approach. And bottom-up approach is not actually a cost estimation method. Well, it's not a cost estimation method in the sense that you cannot use it independently. You will not get a point estimate by only using bottom-up approach. Bottom-up approach involves making a work breakdown structure, VBS, which you should be familiar with from the previous course. VBS works like this. You start with the whole project, right, as one big entity. Then you take and disaggregate it into smaller components. And then you take those smaller components and disaggregate them into even smaller components, and then those smaller components into even smaller components. And you keep doing that until you reach a so-called work package. Work package can be defined as any unit of work that can be reasonably accomplished by one unit of person power within like a reasonable amount of time. So basically, when you don't feel there's any benefit for disaggregating any further, then you reach what's called a work package. So a bottom-up approach involves kind of making a list of all these work packages and then somehow estimate the cost of each work packages and sum them up instead of just trying to estimate the cost of the entire project outright. So a bottom-up approach, make a VBS, try to estimate the cost of each work packages instead of just calculating directly the cost of the entire project. Bottom-up approach does not tell you how to actually estimate the cost of the work packages. So instead, you will have to rely on some of the other methods. So therefore, it's not an independent method. So usually what we do is to just apply expert judgment. You consult your intuition if you are an expert to kind of feel your way to figure out what is the cost of this particular work package. Now, what are the other methods? We also have something called 3-point estimation. 3-point estimation is actually not an independent method either, because it will not give you any point estimate if you only use it. 3-point estimation is basically more of a way to kind of augment expert judgment. Expert judgment has an issue with that you can fall victim to what's called cognitive bias, more on that later, when you rely on your intuition. So because of that, we can use 3-point estimation to kind of correct and control and adjust for some of the more well-known biases. So what you do, instead of coming up with based on your expert judgment, instead of coming up with just one estimate, like I believe the cost is going to be 100 millions, you come up with 3 estimates. What the most likely, what you think is going to be, the worst case scenario, and the best case scenario. And then you take like the average of that, either the weighted average or the unweighted average, depending on if you're assuming a PERT distribution, which is a beta distribution in disguise, or if you're using a triangular distribution. So take the average, and that's basically it for 3-point estimation. Now, 3-point estimation doesn't seem to be that much going on initially, but if you start to think about it, you will realize that 3-point estimation is actually kind of a Monte Carlo simulation in disguise, but again, more on that later. Now, another method here is called parametric cost estimation. And this method is perhaps more technical, more theoretical. Actually, from a theoretical point of view, I would say that parametric cost estimation is the superior method compared to these other ones. So parametric cost estimation could actually mean anything, but in practice it almost always just means one thing. And that is that you run a cross-sectional ordinary least square regression analysis, where you have the project costs on the left-hand side, or alternatively, you have the cost of a particular work package if you are combining it with bottom-up approach. So the cost on the left-hand side of the equation, and the right-hand side of the equation, you have different cost drivers. So for instance, if you're going to build a road, maybe the cost drivers will be the length of the road, and how many lanes you have, and so kind of measure of the difficulty of the landscape perhaps, and so on and so forth. So you use your statistical technique called regression analysis to do empirical modeling. So that involves a lot of theory, a lot of number crunching, a lot of actual equations. So this is perhaps like the most scientific way to do parametric, or to do cost estimation using parametric approach. So yeah, that is probably my favorite method, and my students are mostly just engineer students, so I think they will appreciate parametric cost estimation the most, and they might be a little bit hesitant and skeptical about the previous methods like expert judgment. So what is next? What other methods do we have? We have something called analogous cost estimation. Analogous cost estimation, the defining characteristic there is that you estimate the cost of a project based on only one single previous data point. So if you know the cost of a previous project and you know the value of its cost driver, and then you know the value of the cost driver of a new project, you can kind of scale the old project. So this is presented as a different or a uniquely different method in the Project Management Body of Knowledge, the PM book, but that isn't actually quite true. So when you take my course, you will do the math, and I'm going to prove to you that the PM book is lying to you. This is a great conspiracy, I tell you. Analogous cost estimation is actually no different than parametric. Actually, analogous cost estimation is just the very special case of an ordinary least square cross-sectional regression analysis when you only have one observation. So if you plug in only one observation, one real observation, and an artificial 0-0 observation into the equations for OLS regression, then you will actually end up with the equation for analogous cost estimation. These two methods is just one and the same. So that is quite interesting. What other things do we have? We have something called group decision-making techniques. And I guess an alternative word for that would just be wisdom of crowds. So the idea here is that you shouldn't have only one individual doing the cost estimation. You should have a group of different individuals, and they should do their estimation independently, and then you should aggregate their independent cost estimates to get something that is more precise and accurate. So this is kind of the polar opposite of the philosophy of expert judgment. In expert judgment, the philosophy is to go out there and find the single best expert that you can find and ask that person. In group decision-making techniques, they kind of say, no, forget about the experts. Just find a group of individuals. They don't have to be experts, but it doesn't matter if they are. But just make sure that they are working independently from each other, and also that they are diverse in a cognitive sense. And if you do that, then you can end up with estimates that is more accurate than any one single expert would have been able to provide. So that is group decision-making techniques. A kind of a spin-off of that is called vendor bid analysis. And that is when you have a project and you don't want to do it yourself. You don't want to do an in-house solution, and you do a procurement either for the whole project or parts of it. Then you can address the industry and ask, okay, can some kind of contractor give me a cost estimate? And if you have several different contractors coming up with different cost estimates, you can kind of aggregate their different cost estimates. So basically, very much the same as group decision-making techniques. So an important concept within vendor bid analysis would be things such as winner's curse, for instance. Another method here, reserve, is again not really a method for coming up with a point estimate. Reserve just say that provided that you have a cost estimate, often called a baseline, you should add a little bit extra fat on the budget, like a contingency reserve, because it's very likely that things will go wrong, and in case they do, it's nice to have a contingency reserve. So reserve analysis basically to say, once you have a baseline, add on a little bit extra. So not really a method itself. So reserve is actually more about the second part of the course, the PDF, finding the uncertainty of the point estimate. So based on that analysis, when we identify the probability density function, then we can use that to determine how much reserve should we have. Now let's see what other methods do we have. We have something called cost of quality. This is not really a cost estimation method. It essentially just says that the higher the quality, the higher the cost. So this is a method I will not cover whatsoever in this course. So one final method here is called project management software. And as the name kind of implies, this isn't really a real method either. What it means is that you just use some software to implement any of the other, or any combination of the other methods. And for my course, we are going to use Excel, because in my study program, we have a learning outcome that the student should learn Excel. So I'll be teaching Excel, and also be teaching Visual Basic Applications, which is the programming language of Excel. So yeah, that's the 10 different methods. We have the expert judgment, we have bottom-up, we have parametric, analogous, group decision-making techniques, we have 3-point estimation, vendor bid analysis, cost of quality, which is skip, and project management software. Those are the 10 different methods that we're going to cover in my course, and the aim here is to come up with some kind of point estimate. Now the second part of the course, that is about the probability density function, to identify the uncertainty of the course, or not the course, but of the cost estimate, And the basic tool we're going to use to do that is called Monte Carlo simulation. And you probably come across Monte Carlo simulation a few times already in your study program, in your courses. But there are basically three things I want to teach you when it comes to Monte Carlo simulation. First of all, I want to teach you a little bit about the theory behind Monte Carlo simulation. Then we're going to cover things that kind of ventures a little bit into just computer science. I want to teach a little bit about things such as pseudo random number generators. I also want to teach a little bit about the universality of the uniform. So basically, I want to teach you how exactly do we generate random numbers from any kind of desired statistical distribution. So just a little bit of the theory behind that. The thing with Monte Carlo simulation is that it's not enough just to know the theory. Monte Carlo simulation can be a bit challenging in the sense that we don't really have any convenient software that can just implement a simulation for you with the click of a button. At least not for all kind of applications. So in most cases, you will probably have to do a little bit of programming in order to be able to pull off running a Monte Carlo simulation. So that is second part under the second part there. So finding PDF, teach the theory of Monte Carlo simulation, and also teach you a little bit of programming. And as I mentioned already, we're going to use Excel. So we're going to do Monte Carlo simulation in Excel. You can use worksheet functions, that kind of works, but it's more efficient to use VBA, or the Visual Basic Application, which is the programming language of Excel. So I will be teaching Excel and VBA to enable you to be able to run Monte Carlo simulations. But you can also use this to implement other things such as parametric cost estimation and so on and so forth. So what are the things I'm going to cover here? If you already know programming, this is not going to be difficult, it's going to be pretty straightforward. I'm just going to do the basics of programming. So knowing if then else logic is an obvious things to cover, different data types, loops like for loop, while loop, for each loop, that kind of things. So just basic concepts within programming, and we're going to do that in Excel. So you probably already know Python programming from your other courses, so I don't think it will be too difficult to learn Excel. No question is, of course, why am I using Excel? If the students already know Python, why bother with Excel? The reason for that is that out we call it the real life. We work at the university, we don't live in real life, we live in our ivory towers, so we talk about out there as the real life. But out in the real life, Excel is still king, okay? Yeah, sure, many arguments can be made that Python is vastly superior, but ultimately, quite often, it is Excel that's being used. And when you're working in a team, or if you are reporting to a boss, usually you need to use the software that is most well known. So if your boss only knows Excel, then you might have to be forced to only use Excel. So for that reason, we are teaching Excel. Now, of course, I don't mind if students don't want to use Excel later on in life. If they instead want to use Python or R or C++, whatever, that is fine. But for this course, we are focusing on VBA and Excel. So the third and final component of teaching Monte Carlo simulation here is to give some subject matter expertise on the phenomenon that you want to simulate. Of course, you need to know how Monte Carlo simulation works, you need to be able to program to implement it, but you need to know something about the underlying phenomenon that you want to simulate, obviously. That is going to be cost overruns, which is a measure of how wrong we are regarding our cost estimates. So I will be teaching the theory, and I will go to theoretical research and also to empirical research when it comes to cost overruns in project. And this is basically based on my own research, or I did a PhD in project cost overruns. So this is very much based on the research I came across and was doing myself. So that is kind of the overview of my course. Two things: find a point estimate, and there we have 10 different methods from the PM book, the Project Management Body of Knowledge. And the second part, do Monte Carlo simulation to be able to identify the probability density function, which is the measure of the uncertainty of that point estimate. And there we're going to cover three things: the theory of Monte Carlo simulation, some basic programming in Excel, and also subject matter expertise of project cost tolerance, both theoretical and empirical research. So that is content-wise what you're going to do in this course. So let me move on to just mention a little bit of the literature I'm going to be using. So the thing is that there isn't really any curriculum or teaching books that I use in this course. And that is because there aren't really that many books about cost estimation. I have looked for a while, and I have basically only found 2 books, and neither of them are particularly good in my opinion. So the problem is that there aren't really that much books dedicated to the topic of project cost estimation. There are many books about on project management, and usually you can find 1 or 2 pages in those books about cost estimation, but that is not enough. Because we are looking at such a narrow set of topics and going so deep, we have to extensively rely on the secondary literature that is aimed at something else, but that incidentally are telling us something that is useful for our purposes. So for that reason, I'm going to rely on a lot of different books. Now, I could give you a very long list of different academic, scholarly, scientific articles to read. But personally, I kind of want to avoid that because reading academic papers is a nightmare. I think you need a little bit of training to just be able to read such papers, because they use like an academic writing style. So extensively, I have tried to find alternatives to scientific papers. So I've been looking for books, the type of books that you could find in the bookstore in the airport. The kind of books that you can find available as audiobooks, for instance, something that is more nice and interesting to either listen to or to read. So that is basically my philosophy when it comes to finding the recommended secondary literature. So let me just go through some of the books that I have found. I'm sure by the time you take this course, my list here is outdated, so this is just like something I will just keep compiling. Okay, so let's go through my recommended books. Let us start by talking about the recommended books that is relevant for the expert judgment approach to estimating costs. So expert judgment involved, go and ask an expert. There are 2 questions I want you to be able to answer by the time you are the time you're done with my course, right? So my first question is: can we actually trust experts? I mean, it makes sense if you want an answer to something, go and ask an expert, but really, can we actually trust the experts? And I have the perfect book for that. That is a book written by Tetlock. So, Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It? And How Can We Know? So, this book is absolutely recommended to read when it comes to expert judgment. So, Tetlock, he is an academic, he's a scientist, and what he did, he followed almost 300 self-proclaiming experts, mostly within economics and politics, and he followed them for 20 years, where he kept track of them. He gave them prediction tasks pretty frequently, and he kept track of how well they were performing. He was calculating what's called the Abreu score. So after 20 years, he concluded that experts within economics and politics and that sort of things, they were on average at least, they were as accurate as dart-throwing chimpanzees. So when it comes to binary prediction tasks, for instance, will the Republican presidential candidate win next election, yes or no? It's like a binary prediction here. They were correct 50% of the time on average. So that means you could just flip a coin. So this book here kind of gives us some empirical evidence on how accurate experts tend to be. So this I really recommend this book. The book though is a little bit difficult to read, perhaps. So Tetlock, he wrote a second book called Super Forecasting, The Art and Science of Prediction, a manual for thinking clearly and in an uncertain world. And it's co-written with Dan Gardner. So this book kind of gives a shorter, more easy to read summary of the first book. So I really recommend both of these 2 books. Can you trust the experts? There's another book that I really want to recommend. That is the absolute classic Kahneman's 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And I think I have it right here. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Absolute read. Expert judgment most of the time involves an expert consulting their own intuition, their own gut feeling. Now, intuition seems a bit wishy-washy and vague, but it is defined as the set of mental heuristics and rules of thumb that you have created and modified as you accumulate tacit knowledge from your own personal experience. But the problem with the intuition is that, or these mental heuristics, is that you fall victim to systematic errors of judgment, and that is called cognitive bias. So Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, can tell us a lot about the perils or the strengths and weaknesses of relying on what he calls for System 1, which is this fast, effortless, intuitive, automatic thinking, which basically expert judgment is based on. So these two books absolutely recommended to read when it comes to try to figure out here, can we trust experts, yes or no? Now the second question I want you to be able to answer after taking my course when it comes to expert judgment is not only can we trust expert, but also how can you become an expert? And there's two reasons I want you to know how people become experts, because that can help you to become the expert yourself, so you can use your own expert judgment, but it can also help you to identify who is an expert and who isn't, because you can't just ask people. If you read Kahneman's book, you will learn that people's confidence in their own competence and skills and knowledge cannot really be trusted, for instance because of something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So what makes someone an expert? I think the book that is a good way to start with is Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. I don't think I have that book with me here today, but Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outlier, I think it came out in 2008, if I remember correctly. That book kind of goes through different case studies and gives examples of of the best and brightest in different disciplines. And the crux of the book is to discuss whether or not the talented people or the highest performers of the world, if they are good because they have some kind of inborn, innate talent, or if it is because of hard work. And the conclusion of the book is that talent isn't really a thing, it doesn't really exist, it's all about hard work. And that book has kind of popularized a rule or idea that's called the 10,000 hour rule, or the 10-year rule, which says that you need to spend 10,000 hours of practicing in order to become an expert of something. So that's an interesting book to read. The book has a problem though. The 10,000 hour rule, which is popularized in Malcolm Gladwell's Outlier book, is actually based on a 1993 paper written by Anders Ericsson and a few colleagues, I don't remember the names. And that book is about German violin students, where they asked how much time have you spent studying and that sort of things. The problem is that according to Anders Ericsson, Malcolm Gladwell misunderstood Anders Ericsson's 1993 paper. So in 2016, Anders Ericsson published his own book called Peak, The Art and Science of Expertise, I think it was called. I'll put it on the screen. And there he kind of talks about the limitations of Gladwell's presentation of the 10,000 hour rule. First of all, 10,000 hours is not really a magical number, it's nothing special with 10,000. How much time you actually require varies from discipline to discipline. If you want to become an expert at playing the violin or chess, then you actually need way more than 10,000 hours. And if you want to become the world's best at memorizing random digits, which is the case he talks about in his book, then you only need a couple of hundred hours, you don't need thousands of hours to do that. So how much time you need varies from discipline to discipline. But the biggest weakness is that 10,000 hours only says something about the quantity, not the quality. It does not matter how much time you spend if you're only doing what is called naive practice. So Anders Ericsson says you also need quality. Specifically, you need to do something called deliberate practice, which he talks a lot about in his book, what it is and how it works. So to identify an expert, you need to find someone who has been doing deliberate practice for not 10,000 hours, but a very long time, at least. Now, in order to be able to do delivery practice for such a long period of time, we need something special to be able to pull that. We need something called grit. So, Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, Why Passion and Resilience Are the Secret to Success. She talks about the best predictor of success, so predicting people who will eventually become experts and expert performers, isn't really any innate talent. The best predictor is actually a psychological thing called grit, which is basically a combination of perseverance and passion for a long-term goal. So this is also really recommended. So if you want to identify an expert, look for people who have grit, essentially. So those are some good books that I think you definitely should read. They're also available as audiobooks, I think. There are a couple of other books I will just put in my course. But you don't really need to read exactly these books. Kahneman, for instance, Thinking Fast and Slow. 10 years after that book came out in 2011, you had a decade where every single time I went to the bookstore in the airport, there was always a new book, which was basically just like a rip-off, basically just a copy, a Kahneman clone, I like to call them. And there are many of them. I have one here, for instance, which is called The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf W. So this one is written by journalists, so it's a lot shorter, a lot easier to understand. It gives you the gist of what's going on. So this is a book with a list of the different cognitive biases. So that is interesting. A few other books also. I think in order to be able to do 10,000 hours or more with delivery practice, you need grit, but you also need to kind of have need to turn learning into a habit. So there are hundreds of books, self-help books about habits and how to improve your lifestyle sort of things. I read many of them, but I think if I had to give a recommendation, the two best books I can think of is Atomic Habit. I think I have them here. Let's see. Yeah, so if I had to recommend two books about habits, I think I would recommend Atomic Habits. An easy improved way to build good habits and break bad ones. Tiny changes, remarkable results. So this is written by James Clear. He's not an academic, but I think he gives you a very good overview. And if you also get a little bit more academic, you have The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do and How to Change by Charles Duhigg. So those are the books I think I would recommend when it comes to expert judgment. And I think I also would recommend another book written by Daniel Kahneman. I only read it once so far, but it is called Noise. So, a flaw in human judgment. So, the Thinking Fast and Slow book talks about your bias, and this one talks about like the noise. So those two things are important when it comes to expert judgment. So let's see, what else? When it comes to bottom-up approach, I don't really have any dedicated literature I want to recommend. The core of bottom-up approach is basically just this work breakdown structures, and that you can read about in basically any teaching book about project management. Just take any project management book you have, I can almost guarantee you there's going to be something in there about breakdown structures, so that's good enough. Basically anything works here. When it comes to parametric cost estimation, this is basically just statistical modeling, empirical modeling, regression analysis, econometrics. So there are hundreds of books that you can use here. I probably have to come up with a specific one, but any kind of book on about statistics or econometrics or regression analysis. There probably are a dedicated chapter to regression analysis in machine learning books. So this is very much academized, so this is I will put in something there. When it comes to reserve, I guess a relevant thing to put in there is actually Kahneman's book, Noise again. When it comes to 3-point estimation, the literature there is actually going to be, again, Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. So the idea is that 3-point estimation is something you apply to expert judgment in order to kind of adjust for some kind of cognitive biases, over-optimism, for instance. So that is just Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow book again. When it comes to project management software, I don't really need the book there. There's so much materials, like freely available on the internet. On YouTube, there are so many videos you can look up there. So, but if I had to put in something, which I kind of have to, I just went to my campus bookstore and they had this book, Excel VBA. Get Excel to do more for you in easy steps, plain English, easy to follow, fully illustrated. And the book is so-so, but we need to put in something there. But anything really kind of works there. So when it comes to group decision-making techniques, there is a lot of literature, a lot of academic literature. But I think I want to avoid academic papers as much as possible, as I mentioned. So there are two books that I think is a definite read when it comes to group decision-making techniques. First off, we have a 2004 book by James Surowiecki. He's a journalist, and his book is called Wisdom of Crowds. I have it right here. So, Wisdom of Crowds, Why the Many Are Smarter Than the Few, by James Surowiecki. So it's very similar to Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers. So James Surowiecki, he takes many different cases and he look at where a diverse group of independent individuals together have managed to come up with really accurate predictions. So that's a definite read. The problem with the book though is that it's not very academic. It's a very good introduction to the topic of wisdom of crowds, but it tells you not really that much about how it works, what the conditions are, like the mathematics behind it. So for that I'm going to recommend another book, which is written by Scott E. Page, and it's called The Difference. I don't remember the subtitle there. And this book really goes into detail of wisdom of crowds. It explains exactly what is meant by cognitive diversity. It creates kind of a tool frame for that. Framework for that, and it also really goes into that to explain exactly the mathematics and intuition behind it. Why does wisdom of crowd work? Under what conditions does it work? How does it work? The mathematics is explained there. So that book is actually intended for a more general audience. He has of course academic publication about the topic, but this book is easier to understand than those papers. But this is a very difficult book to read, I have to admit. So that is the books that I'm recommending based on these 10 different methods from the project management body of knowledge. There are a lot of other books that also is somewhat relevant. Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, for instance, is also a bit relevant, I suppose. But I will put a more extensive list on my course page. When it comes to the second part of the course, it's about finding the probability density function. When it comes to the theory of Monte Carlo, then I don't really have anything specific there. Any book on simulation or any book on statistical books, teaching books that covers simulation, or any machine learning books can kind of give you what you need here. And I don't really think you need a book for this. You can also find so much available on the internet, so this is pretty easy. When it comes to programming, I already mentioned I put this one on the reading list. But when it comes to expert or subject matter expertise here of project cost overruns, I don't think there's any particularly good book I will recommend directly there. There's a lot of academic research here. I think the most famous paper that I reference is a 2004 paper by Friberg and some colleagues. And what they did is that they kind of made like a theoretical framework here, stating there are three fundamental reasons for cost overruns. One of the reasons is that random errors and mistake. Another fundamental reason is strategic misreporting. That's when whoever is estimating cost is intentionally lying because they want to, if this is procurement for instance, then they want to win the bid for instance. But the third fundamental reason is cognitive bias. So a really important concept within cost overruns is just cognitive bias, and the go-to book there is of course again Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and also his second book or one of his other book Noise. Other than that, I guess I could put my own research on the reading list, but I'm not going to do that. But I probably will prescribe some other articles from the literature. So yeah, that's just a selection of different books that I find very interesting. And that's going to be on the recommended secondary literature. You don't actually have to read all these books. I kind of don't really expect my students to read the 20, 30 different books I have found. The reason I have selected, another reason why I have selected like these sort of books that you can find in the airport bookstore, is that it's so easy to kind of get the gist of these books based on TED Talks and summaries on YouTube, that sort of things. So I think you should be familiar with the concepts of the books, but you don't necessarily have to read the books themselves. So yeah, that's gonna be it for this lecture 0 of my second course, project cost estimation and risk analysis. See you around for the other lectures.